At least the one.
Yeah, that's
the complications
or something like that. And we're doing this big show out at NATO, actually.
Yeah, because obviously there's a summit, so inevitably there's another big.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, both to the happy few here in the audience and the most people online. On behalf of the Netherlands Atlantic Association, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you at this online panel discussion about Britain's role in the world. My name is Paul Bril. Let me start with a quote. There was a long, hard time when I kept far from the remembrance of what I had thrown away when I was quite ignorant of its worth. End of quote. This is not Boris Johnson in a sincere mood contemplating Britain's fate after leaving the European Union. It is a quote from Great Expectations, the famous Charles Dickens novel that lent its title to this session. A title to which we have added a question mark in order to outline our debate today about the policy paper that the British government published about 6 weeks ago. This comprehensive review of the foreign and security policy of the United Kingdom, the first of its kind in many years, if not in many decades, lays out a vision for Britain's role in the world in the post-Brexit era. How solid is the analysis of this policy paper? To what extent is the UK really able to act as the global player that it clearly wants to be? Is there such a thing as a pocket-sized superpower? What does it all mean for NATO, for Europe, and for the Netherlands? To answer these questions, we have three eminent panelists with us. And let me quickly introduce them. I won't read out their complete CVs because then I would fill the whole hour that we have at our disposal. So quickly. First in London, Jamie Shee, a man with a impressive professional and academic career in Brussels and London, But whether he likes it or not, his ticket to fame is and will probably remain his role as NATO spokesman during the Kosovo War in 1999. Our second speaker is Ian Lesser. He joins us from Brussels. Lesser is Vice President at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and Executive Director of the GMF office in Brussels. He will give us the Atlantic perspective on Britain's search for its place in the world. And last but not least, only 1.5 meters from me is Rem Korteweg, Senior Researcher at the Dutch Klingendahl Institute, where he is the leading expert on post-Brexit Britain. Each of our panelists will make introductory remarks, and I may follow up each presentation with 1 or 2 questions of my own. But I'll try to save enough time for a number of questions from the audience. Some of you have sent in a question in advance. Now let me start with Jamie Shee, and before I ask him to make his introductory remarks, let me simply ask him, Jamie Shee, have you already enlisted as a reserve naval officer for the protection of Jersey?
Yes, as somebody who speaks fluent French and who has lived happily in France for many years, I might end up in the French Navy before I ended up in the Royal Navy, Paul. But thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to thank the Atlantic Commission for inviting me. When I was at NATO, some of my most pleasant times were working for Dutch bosses like Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, the Secretary General, and coming up to the Netherlands to participate in Atlantic Commission debate. So even if it's virtual today, I'm glad to have another opportunity. I'm also speaking to you today from Scotland. I'm up near Glasgow for a couple of days. Okay. And I mention this because, of course, the Scots are voting today in their national election. And if the Scottish Nationalist Party succeeds in getting an absolute majority, then global Britain might have to be redefined much faster than people in London are accounting for. Now, Paul, I'm a Brit, so I feel duty bound to try to make sense of my country's foreign and security policies. But I am a European I've lived in Brussels for over 40 years, and so I am obviously tainted by the experience of the 40 plus years that the UK spent in the EU and everything I thought was gained rather than lost during that period. So I've got a kind of psychological schizophrenia divide that I have to try to straddle today. But in a couple of minutes, I'll do my best. But I'm really delighted also to be here with 2 of the best people that I could wish to accompany me on this journey of trying to make sense of it all, Ian and Rem. Well, look, the integrated review has been in the works since 2015. It was due out in 2015, but for a number of reasons, not least, of course, the British referendum on leaving the EU, it was postponed and postponed and postponed, and therefore only came out a couple of months ago. Now, that means, of course, that it's not simply a Brexit-driven document. It's something that was designed, as any strategic defence and foreign policy review is meant to do, to take account of developments over the last 5 or 6 years since the previous review. And of course, as always, not simply to be driven by economic circumstances or the dictates of the UK Treasury. So yes, there is something about Brexit, but what I want to point out is it's something that takes a much larger perspective in doing this. It was done across government with all of ministries contributing to design to be a whole of Whitehall approach. There are 3 particularly important component parts: the integrated review of foreign development, security policy, Britain's role in the world, a defence command paper, which has some very interesting things to say about the future of warfare and the revamping of the UK armed forces, which is quite radical, and probably the most radical element of the whole exercise, in my view, is what it says about the future shape and role of the UK armed forces. Elsewhere, I find much more continuity with classical British foreign policy than real change. More about that in a moment. And then finally, a defence industrial paper. The Stimulus, of course, are four things. Number one, yes, Brexit, and what it means for new opportunities. As you know, so much of the Brexit debate was taken up with the negative aspects of the divorce agreement with the vis-a-vis the EU. Global Britain was never really discussed during that 4-year rather painful process. And so now, of course, what the government has tried to do is point to the opportunities that once we've got through the messy divorce, we may have in the future. The second thing, though, is the changing international order, the threats to multilateralism from the rise of the authoritarians and how the UK can shape the response of the global democracies. And I think, Paul, you've seen a kind of down payment of that with the UK hosting the G7 foreign ministers in London just this week and having quite a lot to say about the challenge of Russia and China. The next thing, of course, is how the UK, like all of us, deal with the emerging security challenges, cyber, space, the lessons learned from the pandemic, the increasing impact of climate change on foreign and defence policy, and then, of course, inevitably Russia, China, and how you balance a posture between the two. And at this time, where both of them, Russia and China, are increasingly working closer together. Three particular audiences. First of all, UK officials. The integrated review is designed to be granular enough to actually give some kind of guidance to ministers, to civil servants in Whitehall in terms of the overall direction of travel. Secondly, the UK public. The Conservative government has tried in this review to try very hard to convince the public, despite all of the Brexit woes, trade restrictions, the Northern Ireland border question, and so on, that there are opportunities out there and to deliver, if you like, a positive vision for the future. Whether the UK public believes in it is another issue. Certainly with the COVID crisis, they haven't really had much time to think about it. So we'll have to probably wait for the answer to that. And then finally, Britain's international partners and allies, particularly in NATO, it's designed as a reassurance mechanism, again, that there's going to be more continuity than change. Now, in terms of continuity, very much an emphasis on Russia as the main threat and the need to reinforce NATO, which will be Britain's principal defence commitment. That's very reassuring to particularly allies in Central and Eastern Europe who worried that this paper would show a shift away from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. But the slogan is Britain has left the EU, but is not leaving Europe. Secondly, on the Indo-Pacific, a clear desire there to do it through diplomacy, but also to be more militarily present. In a couple of days' time, the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier with a task force, with a Dutch frigate, I understand, actually joining that mission, as well as a US destroyer, so demonstrating that the UK is not intending to ramp up in the Indo-Pacific by itself, but sees this as part of an overall Western coalition to be more present in the area and to develop closer relations with those countries. As you saw in London this week, Dominic Raab invited, in addition to Japan as a G7, Australia, India, South Korea, South Africa too, the presidency of ASEAN to join at that meeting. But the emphasis is not simply on having ships in Singapore, but overall diplomacy. A much larger emphasis on human rights. The one thing that the UK has wanted to do is to move maps faster than the EU with things like Magnitsky sanctions on Russia, its strong reaction to the treatment of the Uyghurs, its strong reaction to China over Hong Kong, to have more freedom, therefore, to take selective sanctions on human rights beyond the EU consensus as well. Also, that Britain is open for talent, although this goes hand in hand with a much more restrictive visa and immigration system. And then the main thing is the idea of flexibility, that post-Brexit, in the integrated review, the UK will lead through clusters, diplomatic clusters, which will be both ideological in terms of defending democracy, but pragmatic in terms of who is willing to team up. And again, the G7 this week was an illustration of how the UK wants to play that role. In other words, the UK sees itself as a kind of convener of coalitions of the willing, of the good guys, of the Democrats, who are willing to work with it as a medium-sized but influential global power around certain issues. And those coalitions, those clusters will sort of vary according to what you are going to do. Now, of course, the UK has helped this year, Paul, in playing this role by the fact that chance has it that at the very moment when Brexit is consummated, the UK chairs the G7 and therefore has the limelight, particularly in hosting Biden in Cornwall in June, and of course also is hosting the COP26 in Glasgow together with Italy and the G20. So in a way, it's a kind of good year for the UK to sort of show its ability as a convener. But once the year is up and we no longer have the G7 chair and the COP20 is over, of course, it's going to be much more difficult for the UK from an institutional base to play that kind of role. The four sort of core objectives behind all of this are, number one, an enormous emphasis on science and technology. I mean, the UK really has bought into this notion that the future of power is in innovative science, co-creation, venture capital, taking risks. I mean, the UK, I think, and I'm not the government spokesman here, but has really prided itself on the fact that, Oxford University and AstraZeneca got out the first vaccine, a triumph for British science, and innovation, what this plucky island, which produced the Beatles and David Beckham and all of that, is capable of doing. So there's an enormous emphasis throughout the entire integrated review on this need to foster science and technology, which alone can secure the place of the democracies vis-a-vis the challenge of China and tech. I mentioned human rights and the notion of a more orderly system of norms and values, particularly when it comes to space and cyber and dealing with climate change and so on. Although what the UK specifically is proposing in terms of space norms or cyber norms or the future of nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, we have to wait. An emphasis on punching above its weight in military terms. I mean, the integrated review delivers 2.2% of GDP, more than the NATO target on defence, but it comes with some significant cuts to the size of the Royal Navy, 10,000 to the size of the Army, in order to pay for these new sort of digitally enabled special commando forces, which will be at the forefront of British military capability in the future, and the aircraft carriers. Finally, resilience. Again, the pandemic lessons, the need for the UK to take the lead in fostering resilience targets in terms of being able to cope and deal with shocks. And I think the UK will push for NATO to have resilience as a core task in the future. Now, Paul, I'm almost at the end. So there are, of course, some important constraints here, which I know are going to come up in the debate. Number one, sovereignty. The integrated review shows an obsession with the recovery of sovereignty as an absolute value. Take back control, the whole theme of the Brexit debate. But of course, the problem is that having regained sovereignty from the EU, as soon as we conclude a trade agreement with China or some other multilateral trade pact or some defense pact, we are going to have to surrender sovereignty, because all viable international cooperation is based on the notion that shared sovereignty produces more sovereignty. And this is going to be a painful thing when the UK, having regained it all, suddenly finds itself having to give it up. The second big challenge is everywhere and nowhere. The integrated review shows a desire to be present on every continent, present in every major global issue, in every major global cluster. But to be everywhere is to be nowhere. This is not a document which has really done much of an effort to make any kind of painful priority setting or painful choice setting. Next thing, and I pointed this out to John Bew, the British academic who wrote the integrated review in a debate. I said, John, at the end of the day, when it's global Britain, what is really new? Because we were in the EU for 40 years and we were a UN Security Council member. We were in the G7. We had the Commonwealth. We had the Five Eyes. So we've all of the relationships that we're talking about at the moment are relationships that since the end of World War II, we have sought to nurture. So, where is the real new element here, except maybe simply in emphasis as well? To do all of these things, and the review refers to this, Paul, we're going to have to piggyback on others. we can't do it by ourselves. We have to piggyback on the US, piggyback on international organizations, piggyback on other institutions in the Indo-Pacific. How is this piggybacking of trying to sort of complement other people's efforts is going to go on as well? And finally, of course, and I know this is going to come up particularly with Rem, maybe Ian as well, but the absence of Brussels. When you talk to the drafters of the review, and I don't know if Ian and Rem have done this, about, well, why have you said so little about Europe? They don't give you an answer. So whereas every other part of the review, I think, is a genuine attempt to rationalize the role and the added value of Britain, in terms of capabilities, in terms of interest, to come up with sensible solutions. The EU institutions is a blind spot because the highly intelligent intellectual authors of the document can't give you a good answer when you ask them, well, why have you said so little about working with the EU? What is the interest here? And it strikes me that this is the one part of the review that was clearly driven by ideology, particularly in the Conservative Party and the current, we have to justify Brexit by any means available type of thing. And clearly this is the part that's going to have to be put right eventually, because if you are an American and you're looking at a firm transatlantic relationship, you need good US-Europe-EU relations, good US-UK relations, but you need also, as part of that leg of the table, good UK-EU relations, and that is missing at the moment, notwithstanding some intelligence and security cooperation, which is part of the comprehensive trade agreement that came into effect on the 1st of January. So that part of it has got to be put back into place. I will finish by saying I see three ways of doing this, not by getting Britain to talk to Brussels anytime soon. With this government, it's not going to happen. But the UK has aligned itself with EU positions on Belarus, on Ukraine, on Iran, the E3, working very closely together. Its stance on China is more in line with the EU, and what it says about China in the review is very, very mild indeed. So regional cooperation is one way to start. Keeping the UK involved in regional frameworks with France, with the Netherlands, with the Northern Group is probably another way to achieve that as well. And the using, of course, the French-German bilateral relationship, which the UK very much wants to maintain, to gradually coax the UK, not with this government, but with a subsequent government, back into a more rational relationship with Brussels. So the integrated review, I think, is more about simply giving a facelift to a traditional British foreign policy, which is not radically new, but in terms of matching these global ambitions with the future economic resources of the UK, which has always been the topic and, if you like, the brake that held back previous strategic concepts. That argument has not gone away. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, you said, Jamie Shee, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. And that raises the question, does that mean that in your view, the concept of global Britain is the wrong way to start a discussion about Britain's foreign and security policy in the next decade?
Well, my sense is that if you are a medium-sized power, effectiveness is normally selecting issues that you particularly want to sponsor. I mean, Norway sponsored the Israeli-Palestinian process a few years ago. Canada has sponsored conventions on landmines and so on and so forth. Estonia has sponsored norms on cyberspace. So powers of the sort of medium rank traditionally sort of have a select number of issues that they choose to sort of run with. And it strikes me that what we don't have in the integrated review, when we look at cyber and climate change and space and pandemics and everything, any sense of prioritization. And I think, as I mentioned, that for a power of the UK's rank is probably lacking. We should be a little bit more selective at where we feel we have a particular interest and a particular ability to influence one of these normative setting debates. I think also there is a contradiction, Paul, between, on the one hand, wanting wanting to be a strong military power, for example, building 800 extra nuclear warheads, for instance, developing a space military command, developing a cyber military command, and on the other hand, wanting to be the champion of norms. For example, the non-proliferation community has already said to the UK, what is it? Developing more nuclear warheads or sponsoring non-proliferation? Where are you going here? So a consistency, if you like, between the idea of being a kind of normative power, leading by intellectual example from a legal diplomatic perspective, and still wanting to have that kind of naked raw military power, which in the UK's eyes is always the essence of being a great power, the having serious military force and being prepared and ready to use it. So just two observations on that one.
Okay, thank you. Let's now turn to Brussels. Ian Lesser, Brussels as the anchor place this time of the Atlantic Alliance. Ian Lesser, how do you assess the review of the UK's foreign and security policy?
Well, Paul, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here with the Atlantic Commission and with friends. And, I'm an American expatriate in Brussels, and I've been here for 10 years. So, let me give you sort of, as you asked, the transatlantic side of this, even though I'm sitting here in Brussels. I think, but there is a connection. And where Jamie ended, in fact, is a very good way to start this conversation because, there is much in here that would be welcomed in Washington, actually. I mean, it's quite an impressive document in a way. I mean, Jamie, you went into this in some detail, and it's precisely because it is so detailed. I mean, if you compare this, for example, to the American National Security Strategy document, it's really a very detailed, sort of much more comprehensive look at where the UK could go. There are some things that the American foreign policy establishment, in particular, the people who've now come in with Biden, would look at this and maybe shake their heads a little bit. But on the whole, for many of the reasons that Jamie mentioned, there are themes that will be common there, and I don't think it's going to bother anyone. Now, having said that, there is an original sin here as far as as much of the American sort of international policy community is concerned, which is that nobody pretty much in this administration anyway likes the idea of Brexit. And in fact, they're deeply opposed to the idea as a matter of public policy. They're unconvincible on this point, with some reason, I think. And that it will necessarily color how this is seen, because this will be seen, I think, in many quarters as simply a way to kind of to bolster, to buck up a weak position, a position that has been weakened unnecessarily. There is a core irony as well, which is that now, if you look at this from the point of view of the Biden administration, people who will be managing transatlantic relations now, you now have an administration that actually takes the European Union seriously. The Trump administration did not. They saw the world in very sovereignty conscious terms, through the lens of nation states and indeed individual actors, individual leaders. You have something much more traditional now, much more Atlanticist. It's in no sense, I would say, well, perhaps only in one sense, very negative on the UK these days, which is the fear that somehow the post-Brexit arrangements are going to complicate the Irish border and that whole host of issues that concern Northern Ireland and Ireland. And that's something that Biden has been very outspoken about. But in terms of, the kind of thing that appears in this strategy, I think it will be seen positively, but against the backdrop of this kind of, as I say, an original sin as far as it's seen in Washington. The special relationship, we've had a discussion about this frankly, for decades. Much of what had become special about the special relationship was the UK's position in Europe. And I think there is a sense for many Americans that something, really has been lost. Not everything, perhaps not most things, but something has been lost in that. The second point I'd make, I think in terms of the regional emphasis, and you underscored this, Jamie, I think there will be a very positive understanding of the sort of hierarchy of security challenges that are laid out or embedded in this document. Because if you listen to American policymakers these days, whether in the Trump administration or in this current administration, China's number one, Russia's number two, and everything else is a third. So that, of course, raises the question over time of how you backfill in terms of European security if it should be necessary. Maybe not immediately, but perhaps 10 years from now, with the United States that is still critical in deterring Russia, but is increasingly distracted and taken up with a strategic competition with China and contingencies potentially in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there is a lot that would be reassuring in there from the point of view of an American strategist that's looking at that kind of an equation. On the sovereignty side, it's not the kind of language that a Biden administration official would use, but in fact, if you look and you probe just a little bit deeper, there is something of this same, a foreign policy that serves the middle class that's in there. It's the vocabulary is different, but then the desire to sort of link up foreign policy, prosperity, sovereignty, again, not used so much in the American context, but anymore, but it's there in the Buy American business and all of this. Not so much of a departure, I think, from some of the thinking in the United States. Third point, I think, given all of this and the post-Brexit situation, it really does put NATO at the center of the relationship in many ways, and I think that's important. I mean, it's very clear that Britain, does very well in terms of conventional measures of burden sharing, 2.2%. There aren't many countries that come up to that level. I mean, that will be appreciated. I think this administration will be just as focused on that as previous administrations with a different style, absolutely. But one of the things that may actually change is that I think the Biden administration will be less orthodox about how you measure burden sharing. They've already signaled this. If you heard what some of the things that Secretary Blinken said when he was in Brussels, that there will be other measures. And they will matter. There are other things that allies can contribute in different areas, including counterterrorism and domestic security and other things that aren't necessarily captured in that 2%. And many of those things do appear in this document on the technology side and other things. So I think, that would be welcomed. Finally, just to conclude, I think, and you mentioned this, Jamie, there are other things that I think align quite well with the view from Washington these days, the increased emphasis on the values side of things, the human rights equation, the democracy promotion, open societies. That term appears a great deal in this document. I think these are things that would resonate actually in a bipartisan way, I would say, in Washington for the most part today, and would probably get a good reception. What is the net kind of story here? I think is a sense of sort of disappointment that about Brexit, which is very hard to overcome in the Washington policy establishment, at least those who are really running the show now. But having said that, it's an impressive document, and there is much, in fact, that would fit with the American outlook and would be appreciated. But it'll be tested by contingencies. I mean, we didn't really talk about this too much, but things happen out in the world. How will the UK behave? How will it be? What will Washington ask for? I think that may have more to say about the future of the relationship than what is in a document. But I leave it at that, and thank you.
Well, Ian Lesser, is it fair to say that the Biden administration would prefer the UK to consider itself to be a European power with global interests instead of a global power with unspecified European interests? Absolutely.
Absolutely. But the formal structure for that has largely been lost. Not entirely. I mean, there are plenty in the American foreign policy establishment who profoundly hope that Brexit at some point will be reversed. I leave to you the odd making on that, but that's something else. No, it was profoundly against American interests. It was seen that way by most people. Not all in the Trump administration. Some of them liked the kind of for ideological reasons, sort of had sympathy. But in general, the U.S. foreign policy establishment thinks this is a foreign, just a negative.
All right.
And would like to see a more European policy. They want to see a more powerful Europe, actually.
Okay.
See it as being an American interest.
Okay, thank you. Let's now turn to Europe. Rem Korteweg. Critics have said that there's a hole in the heart of the review, and that hole is and there is no vision for cooperation with Europe. How do you see that?
I think I've been one of those critics using that term.
Okay.
So if I can be sort of shamelessly plugging the Atlantische Commissie's publication, the Atlantische Perspectief, I have an article in this month's edition where I describe what I term the EU-shaped hole in the integrated review. But before I get to that, like Ian, like Jamie, I think there's a lot in the integrated review which is very good. I think it's a truly integrated strategy document. And looking at it from a Dutch perspective, I mean, here in the Netherlands, we still struggle to really connect different policy fields of external action, whether it's development aid, trade policy, foreign policy, defense policy, in one overarching document. And we can criticize what the result is, and we will, but the fact that the UK has been able to do this and to drive this process from Downing Street number 10 under the supervision of the Prime Minister is a very good thing. And I think more European countries, including my own, should draw lessons from that in how you do that. Secondly, I think one of the issues, I more or less agree with what Jamie said. I generally always agree with what Jamie says because it's the smart thing to do. But one of the things I want to emphasize what he mentioned was this overarching, almost philosophical understanding in the review about which way the international system is developing. What the document says is there is no longer one international order that us think tankers or policymakers like to refer to, the international order. What the document says is we're actually in this period where there are going to be competing international orders, a democratic or democracy-driven international order and an authoritarian or autocracy-driven international order with different value sets, with different systemic dynamics, with different leaders, if you will. And it's a very bleak picture if you draw the logical conclusion of that, what that means for our security environment. It means that sort of at this meta level, we are up in this clash of competing international orders. That really should get us thinking. Now, I've been invited, and thanks for the invitation, to talk about the EU bit and how it also relates to the Netherlands. And like I say, I've been quite critical in this piece I've written. Jamie's already mentioned a little bit about how there is an ideological strain about the EU in the integrated review. As I said, I've described it as an EU-shaped hole. This document, when it comes to the EU, it's infused with Brexiteer rhetoric. There are two instances where the European Union is mentioned. One is a rather formalistic remark about the UK has left the EU, and then it continues to say, and now we will have a more agile, more nimble, more flexible foreign policy. In other words, we should have done this a lot earlier. It's good that we left the EU. It now gives us a foreign policy advantage. Question mark what that is. But that's one statement. A second statement in the document about the European Union is, oh, by the way, we'll work with the European Union, for instance, in areas of sustainability and climate. That's a pretty limited or marginal reading of what the EU brings to bear in the international environment. So the EU is hardly mentioned. We shouldn't be surprised that it's hardly mentioned in terms of foreign and security policy cooperation because we know that's not where the EU's strong point is, and we also know that the UK was never a really strong supporter of CSDP. It was never really a strong supporter of a common foreign and security policy, so that shouldn't really surprise us. But where it should surprise us is that the UK makes this claim of being a preeminent power in Europe, but then doesn't specify what its relationship with the EU should look like. So, in other words, can the UK be a real European power without a functioning foreign policy relationship with the European Union? The answer to that, from my perspective, is no. In other words, this is still in the to-do box. This needs to be filled in. And hopefully, given the news today that the spat around the EU ambassador's legal status or diplomatic status in London is resolved, hopefully that clears the road to move towards a more constructive discussion between the EU on the one hand and the UK on the other hand in how to give way, shape, and form to foreign and security policy cooperation. But the resistance is structural, particularly in this UK government. Remember that it was the UK that simply didn't want to talk about foreign and security policy cooperation in the Brexit talks. Now, there are two reasons why I think the UK would be well advised to take this new opportunity, this positive momentum with the fact that Ambassador João de Valle Almeida has been recognized in his full diplomatic position, to move the discussion forward. Why? There is a lot of momentum inside the European Union to do stuff in defense and security affairs. You only need to look at the European Defense Fund. The momentum is in European defense capability development in an EU context, not in a NATO context. Secondly, as Ian also mentioned, the UK is more useful to Washington if it is more relevant in Brussels. That, I think, should push the UK to at least open the conversation about how to start coordinating foreign policy positions. Particularly one area is at the top of my mind, and that's sanctions policy. The integrated review states very boldly, okay, we now have a sovereign sanctions policy. We can strike, we can install an autonomous sanctions regime outside of EU structures. That's great. But we also know that sanctions are much more effective the more parties are involved. The logical partner for the UK to look towards is the EU. We need to get an EU-UK sanctions dialogue up and running. That would be at the top of my list. If we move in a positive momentum, we could also perhaps envisage that the UK be invited on an ad hoc basis to, for instance, Foreign Affairs Council's meetings, where the UK can then also influence the European foreign policy debate. Now, there's a lot of room also for cooperation with the European Union. I think we've talked a little bit about the Asia-Pacific. This UK tilt towards the Asia-Pacific has been much, I would think, hyped, somewhat exaggerated. The UK is not the only European country pivoting towards the Asia-Pacific. The French have been doing that for years. The Germans are developing an Indo-Pacific strategy. The EU is developing an Indo-Pacific strategy. Even the Netherlands has guidelines on Indo-Pacific policy. And so this is a low-hanging fruit to bring together the UK and European partners to think of a common approach rather than to do things separately. Now, there's another area which deals with, I think, military mobility, which is an EU initiative. And today's news is that this is a PESCO project, so it's an EU-run, EU Commission-run project to improve military mobility with an eye to the threat from Russia, that the United States, Norway, and Canada have been brought in to work on improving that. It would be only sensible to also bring in the United Kingdom. But up until now, the United Kingdom is resistant. So I think we need to flick a switch, if you will, in London to say, like, okay, Brexit negotiations are done. We need to really focus on building this new relationship. There are many, many common interests to pursue. Perhaps a final word on the Netherlands.
Yeah.
The Netherlands gets 2 mentions in the integrated review. One in the context...
That's one more than Belgium.
That's a very typical, that's the way we look at our foreign policy, as long as we're better than Belgium. I mean, the thing that the integrated review mentions, which I think we should take to heart, is that the Netherlands is seen as a potential partner also for its transatlantic orientation, but also in the context of the joint expeditionary framework. So I would envisage that the UK-Dutch dialogue, even though bilateral military relations are of course very strong still, that also in the context of the joint expeditionary force, the relationship between the UK and the Netherlands will improve. Let me leave it here.
All right.
And we'll get to the discussion.
I have a related question from, let me see, Willem van Ekelen, the former Minister of Defense of the Netherlands, who asked, will it be possible to develop joint planning to enable quick action, I guess quick NATO action, Anglo-European action, whenever our interests are threatened? You mentioned that there is a little mention of cooperation between London and Brussels in the review. The natural inclination, British inclination, is of course to deal with Paris and Berlin. So this question that Willem van Ekelen asked, how do you answer? Maybe I should turn to Jamie Shee first.
Paul, very briefly, because Rem is a great defence expert on these questions. But to my mind, is the UK believes that Europe, fortunately, has lots of different structures that it can play with. I mentioned already that the UK is being very committed to the Northern Group, working with the Scandinavian countries. It's taken a very strong interest in Arctic security and recently sent a frigate up to the Barents Sea, very close to Russia. It's been an enthusiastic participant in Macron's European Intervention Initiative, which also brings together EU countries and now with the UK, non-EU countries and countries like Norway, particularly based on special operations in Africa. The UK recently sent 250 soldiers to join the UN peacekeeping force in Mali, and has therefore shown France that it's willing to give it some backing in the Sahel. UK has got obviously a great deal of cooperation with France under the Lancaster House Treaty. So I think the gamble is that the UK can, because it's a power with serious military capabilities, strong budget, investing, advanced space capabilities, advanced cyber capabilities, and it's now turning virtually its whole army into a special commando force for these kind of out-of-area missions. I think the UK gamble is that it will have so many credentials to bring to the table. Yeah. As with the European Intervention Initiative, European leaders like Macron will be willing to go outside the formal EU structures and put together these kind of consortia precisely to make it politically possible for the UK to become involved. And over time, the European defence debate might gravitate more towards NATO and towards these regional structures than within the EU itself. I personally believe this is mistaken, but I think that is what they believe to be the possibility in London at the moment.
Yeah, you mentioned a few examples of bilateral planning, bilateral cooperation, military cooperation. The question is, will the UK be ready to coordinate planning and action with the EU? What do you think?
Well, the EU doesn't have it has its battle groups. There's talk about a new rapid response force among 14 of the EU member states. But I think generally, Jamie is on the mark that what the UK is looking for are other mini-lateral constellation of countries. I would also highlight, the French initiative to develop the European Intervention Initiative, the E2I, which the UK has been interested in. That has momentum. That's outside of formal EU structures. Secondly, when it comes to broader crisis management cooperation, not just operational capabilities. I think also in this country, in the Netherlands, we need to start having a discussion about what we think about the embryonic cooperation in E3 context. So Germany, France, the UK cooperate very closely, of course, on Iran, on the JCPOA. That has remarkably survived the Trump years. It's also now put out statements on the South China Sea, on human rights in general. I think that the E3 is a very interesting new sort of informal structure for bringing in the main security powers of Europe to consider responses to common security challenges. The question is, of course, how do you ensure that the smaller member states that are not involved in the E3 don't feel left out? That is something that could also be managed through your EU structures. You could, for instance, involve the HRVPs or Josep Borrell. We're still in the first the first meters of that race, but those are two sort of concrete suggestions.
Is the E3 concept, the cooperation between Berlin, Paris, London, is that something that the Atlantic Alliance welcomes? Or does it see it as a problem?
Well, you know, I don't, the short answer is I don't know. My suspicion is that the current administration would look favorably on something like that if they felt that it was effective. I mean, this really is it. I mean, it's very noticeable that when it comes to these kinds of debates, there is a kind of, for any American administration, a kind of preference for a kind of practical measures rather than the kind of theological debates about variable geometries and who fits where and all the rest of it. There are some things clearly the United States wants to see more of these days. I think there's still the defense spending piece of it, but there's also things like military mobility. I mean, I think the PESCO relationship that was mentioned earlier, especially around this mobility exercise, is really important. I think it would be very natural for the UK to join it. Anyway, I think all of those kinds of things are really very important. But, you know, also at the end of the day, there was a very interesting comment, I think it was from Carl Bildt today somewhere on Twitter, where he was commenting on this question about the battle groups and so on, that you know, the problem is not capacity for most of the kinds of contingencies we imagine, in his view. The problem is simply the political will to use force in Europe. And that is something that comes to the center of the American debate about this. Where it's one of the reasons why NATO is seen as being particularly critical, because it provides a framework and a kind of predictability and triggers for the use of force, which Americans find reassuring. These other kinds of arrangements, I think, will face practical tests, and if they pass them, then I think the US will be supported.
Okay. Jamie Shee, both you and Rem Korteweg have said that in spite of all your reservations about certain aspects of the review, you see it as an impressive document. What is also impressive is that the British government has pledged, I think, about 16.5 billion British pounds for investments in defense spending. It's especially impressive because here in the Netherlands we are used to very modest increases in defense spending. Nevertheless, many people say there is a terrible mismatch between the scale of ambition and the resources and capabilities available. Do you agree?
Well, Paul, I think that's a very good question. And as I mentioned, that's always been the bugbear of previous British strategic reviews, resources versus level of ambition. I think that the real issue here is that the UK has made a gamble on the future of war. Because it's decided that the future of war will not be sort of big tank battles and massive armies of hundreds of thousands of people clashing with heavy equipment, but it's going to be much more a hybrid kind of activity where small groups of elite forces, data enabled, moving quickly, moving stealthily, are going to sort of come into contact and fight each other. And therefore, what it needs is a small but extremely sort of professional force. I mean, virtually, you know, the whole of the army, the Royal Marines, is now being merged into this new commando force. The overall size of the army being cut down to 70,000 is going to be smaller than at any time since before the Napoleonic Wars. We're scrapping lots of old aircraft, lots of old tanks and planes being phased out. So it's going to be small but high quality. Now, Paul, the success of this depends critically on whether you've guessed the future shape of conflict, because if it turns out not to be the UK vision, and NATO's posture in Eastern Europe vis-à-vis Russia still requires thousands of main battle tanks, thousands of fighter aircraft, and thousands of troops. As Stalin famously said, quantity has a quality all of its own. And isn't this kind of an elite type of stealth, covert sort of engagement, using drones and special forces? Then, of course, the UK will be on the wrong side of history. And I think the most interesting part of the whole integrated review is the part which develops this quite sort of science fiction notion of the future of war. So, in other words, the only way that the UK can pay for the elite force is by scrapping the mass, scrapping the manpower, scrapping the ships, scrapping the bulk. It's going to be 2.2%, a difficult commitment to sustain over time if, of course, the UK economy doesn't rebound quickly after COVID-19. We're still waiting for the answer for that. And of course, there's some criticism here in the UK that the military have been increased at a time when the other plank of the UK policy, which Rem mentioned, the development side, the good citizen side, where the UK was one of the few countries spending 0.7% of the GDP on development under the UN Millennium Goals, that it's been cut by £5 billion back to 0.5%. So, if you're going to have a strong military, while you have this values-based, normative-based, development-based foreign policy, there's an impression that the defence side has benefited, whereas those other more normative, more development aspects, although strong on rhetoric, have been less well-resourced. Although I have to add, Paul, that the UK government does say that as soon as economic circumstances allow, it will try to go back to 0.7% of GDP on development aid.
Okay. A different kind of war, you said, Rem Korteweg. Nevertheless, if you dispatch an aircraft carrier to the Indo-Pacific region, to East Asia, and all the equipment consists of borrowed aircraft from the United States, you have a problem, wouldn't you say?
Yes, but I think it's more a statement of intent rather than an actual show of force, if you will. And the way that the Brits will spin this is that it's a multinational effort. It's putting the carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth at the disposal of a coalition of the willing that includes the Dutch. I mean, as far as I heard, it's great that the Netherlands is also involved with its frigate, but when the going gets tough and the carrier strike group plans to enter the South China Sea, the Dutch will go southward and do a port visit in Jakarta, rejoining the carrier strike group later when the carrier has already left the South China Sea. So we can criticize the UK, but let's not also avoid criticizing ourselves in the meantime.
Then, on the other hand, we are not portraying ourselves as a global power, are we?
No, but we are. I mean, this is one of the questions that European countries have to answer for themselves, is to what degree can you do things by yourself? And to what degree does it make sense to coordinate positions? So the Germans, they also want to send one ship to East Asia. I mean, that's not going to make people in Beijing very anxious. Neither is it a HMS Queen Elizabeth with, as you say, borrowed aircraft. The question is rather, how do you develop a coherent presence, a strategic idea about what Europe, not the European Union, not the UK's, but what Europe's role is in security affairs in the Asia-Pacific. And that's still very much lacking.
All right. I think there is a question from the audience. Can I ask? Or am I mistaken? No? Okay. Then I'll ask. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead. State your name, please.
Jan van Bentham, Nederlands Dagblad. Regarding the position of the Netherlands in this strike group now going to the Pacific region, 22nd of May they will depart, as far as I understood. I also understood that on the 3rd of May, the Minister of Defense in the Netherlands has said that the Dutch frigate will enter the South Chinese Sea with the strike group together. And when you are so involved in such a very high-profile first action in the sense of the global Britain approach, would it also be possible that the Netherlands, with this starting point, could have a position as to intermediate between the UK and the EU or European powers in more security cooperation again, because there are many issues still unsolved. So would this position we now have, cooperating in this first operation, have a special role in it?
Okay, thank you. Rem Korteweg, maybe?
I think at this point in time, it's very necessary to move beyond the Brexit battles, and that we really need to make an effort. And with we, I mean the UK, but also the European Union, also its member states, and also the United States, to ensure that Brexit doesn't lead to drift, sort of strategic drift of the UK away from the European continent. Now, there are elements in the integrated review that should comfort us, the emphasis on European security, the emphasis on NATO. But one of the real challenges we face is that there is no functioning dialogue between the EU and the UK. If the Netherlands can help facilitate that, that would be great. But I don't think it's just going to be the Dutch. I think it will also require a nudge from Washington, perhaps when Biden visits in June, to, bang the British and European heads together and say, like, okay, we need to sort this out. There are bigger fish to fry than to continue the Brexit rhetoric. But the problem is, look at today's news. We're focused on a maritime tussle around the waters of Jersey. We have the Scottish elections, which might raise the spectre of a Skexit, which would raise all sorts of problems about the UK's strategic role in Europe, not to mention the nuclear deterrent. There are questions about how the UK will or will not align with the EU in its efforts to curry favors with India or Japan or South Korea or Australia. We need to get over this. If the Dutch can help do that, great. But I think it will require other states to chip in as well.
Okay, Ian Lesser, would you say that NATO is concerned about a sort of British splendid isolation in the Western alliance?
Well, I think many in NATO would be concerned about that. For all the reasons that have just been mentioned, it's very clear. I don't think there's a big sort of gap when it comes to how this is seen in Washington or frankly in Paris or in Berlin or elsewhere. A more fragmented sort of approach to strategy, to political consensus around contingencies, around planning, around all of these things, around burden sharing, is not good for anybody. I don't think the United States is unique in seeing a strength in a greater integration. And, one of the real ironies, I think, is that after some years of debate in Washington about whether a stronger European pillar was really in the American interest and all the rest of it, mostly the American foreign policy establishment came around to thinking that this was fine. And the stronger it was, the better. As long as there was real investment there, fine, in U.S. interest to see that. And I don't think, I don't think that's changed. So I think, but there is concern that that somehow the Brexit experience will not be easily repaired, and that that the UK and Europe will be slow to put together to build some new connective tissues of different kinds. I think probably that will emerge. But the US has a real stake in that.
All right. Is there, Rem Korteweg, is there a force in Brussels, in the EU, that really wants to reach out to Britain again or are they all, let's say, swept away by their frustrations in dealing with the Johnson government?
No, I don't think that there's a sense of frustration. I think there was always a willingness on the side of both the European member states and the EU as an institution to open discussions about foreign security policy cooperation. As far as I understand it, it came as a surprise that the UK really insisted that it didn't want to include that chapter in the TCA negotiations, the trade agreement negotiations. I think the door is open, but it takes two to tango, to sort of mix my metaphors. As I mentioned, the situation regarding the status of the EU's ambassador in London, that was deeply unhelpful. Now that that's been resolved, hopefully that clears the air and that we can move to that. But I don't think it's never been the EU or the Europeans that were resistant to developing new ideas. I do think that the first move will have to come from London in this.
Okay, let's try to make a final judgment. Jamie Shee, on balance, is the review good or bad for the Western world?
Well, I would say it's good in the sense that it shows that notwithstanding the Brexit trauma, the UK is determined to remain a globally responsible actor which will spend money, time and effort in order to uphold global peace and security. It's high on ambition. As has been said, delivery will be more difficult, but this is not a UK like Trump proclaiming, UK first and putting up the shutters and keeping everybody out. And withdrawing from international organisations and refusing to pay its dues. That's not the shape of it. That would have been worrying if Brexit had led to this kind of national sort of self-isolation obsession. It's not that at all. It shows that the UK wants to be, as I said, maybe everywhere and nowhere, but it has the ambition of at least of punching above its weight and doing everything it can. And as Rem and Ian pointed out, in ways which are consistent with what NATO, the US and everybody else wants. It would have been much easier had we stayed inside the European Union, but I also agree with Rem and Ian that diplomats are pragmatic people, and we just now, given that the UK is not going to rejoin the EU anytime soon, hopefully one day, but not anytime soon, we just have to make these new arrangements work the best way we possibly can. And I think the integrated review at least gives us a chance. The EU piece, as Rem pointed out, is still missing. But in London, in the Conservative Party, across British politics, those 48% of Brits who voted to remain haven't suddenly disappeared simply because Brexit has taken place. And their chance will come again to engage with the EU. The Conservative government of Boris Johnson isn't going to stay in power forever. The one problem, though, I do see in London is that whereas the 52% that voted leave are politically organised, they have a home in the Conservative Party, which is in government at the moment. The problem is that the 48% of Remainers, who include some extremely influential, experienced people in Parliament, in the House of Lords, in academia, in the media, in civil society, they don't have a political home. The Labour Party has been wishy-washy. The Lib Dems are too small to be influential at the moment. And the home of Remain, unfortunately, has gravitated towards the nationalists in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. We badly need an English or British national political party which is willing to coalesce around the type of arguments that we've been making. And so I think it's a domestic challenge for the UK to find a political organisation for the 48% who, believe me, are still very much alive and kicking. I speak to them every day. Of course, just one final thing, Paul. We did not join the EU at the beginning because we thought that it was never going to succeed, but the EU became a tremendous success and we could no longer really benefit from being on the outside. So the more countries like the US, Rem mentioned, is very good, PESCO cooperation, Canada, Norway, the countries that we would be looking for to coalesce outside the EU, the more our allies say, oh no, we're cooperating with the EU. We think it's a great thing. We support what the EU is doing. We're part of it. Britain doesn't want to be Turkey, left in the cold on the outside of all of these arrangements. So the better the EU develops, the more successful the EU is. The UK will then replay the debate of the 1960s that we made a mistake by not joining in the first place, and then we made a mistake by leaving.
Yes. Okay, Ian Lesser, is the Atlantic Alliance strengthened or weakened by the role that the UK puts forward for itself?
Well, when seen from Washington, or even seen from an Atlanticist perspective elsewhere, I mean, there is this Brexit problem, and we spoke about that already. I mean, that's a weakening. Can you get over that? Can you rebuild around it? Of course you can, and we've talked about different ways to do that. So if you think about it in terms of this document we've been discussing, I think it remains quite impressive, actually. The United States ought to do something quite like this, as detailed as this. It's even harder in a way for us, in fact. But we need to do that. It's consequential. I was very struck by, Jamie, your discussion with Rem, you talked about this as well, about the sort of revolutionary character of some of the defense planning assumptions that are in there. Well, we're having a very similar debate in Washington now, very fundamental one. About, what do we do with all these massive, very expensive, but also increasingly vulnerable platforms that we have, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but it's true also in other theaters. In some ways, this is the kind of document that we may be producing in the United States in a few years' time. Just finally, it's quite interesting on that point. It's a kind of a barbell-like strategy in a way, at both ends of the spectrum. You have a reinforcing of the high-end deterrent, the nuclear piece, and you have a reinforcement of the special operations, agile special operations piece, and it's in a way a bet on specialization. But with whom? Others, you have to have others in mind in that respect. And there, I do think, it's the Atlantic partners, European as well, even if maybe unstated in that document.
Okay. In American TV interviews, the final question always is this a good thing or a bad thing? Rem Korteweg, is the review a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, we finally have something of an answer to what Boris Johnson meant when he coined that phrase Global Britain in December 2016. And that's a good thing. And I think it offers a lot of very welcome sort of more investment in defense. I mean, I don't have to repeat all the compliments all three of us have given, but it raises a number of questions, and primarily, of course, about the Europe bit. And let me end on a positive note by saying that it's work half done. I mean, there's the EU-shaped hole can be filled. It's something we need to work hard on both sides, on the EU side as well as on the UK side, to fill it, and then it will be a contribution. We should all hope that the UK remains, as it's been over the past decades, a very reliable, constructive, and important security actor in the European and in the global sphere.
All right. Let me end with another quote from Great Expectations. Ask no questions and you will be told no lies. I think that our three speakers have proven that this is incorrect. Ask questions and you'll get a better understanding of what's going on. Thank you, Jamie Shee. Thank you, Ian Lesser. Thank you, Rem Korteweg. Our time is up. Thank you.